that electricity bill in Hawaii, right? You're surrounded by all this incredible natural beauty, yet you're paying, well, a premium for power.
Yeah, and so much of it coming from imported oil, it feels like a real disconnect, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And Hawaii has set this ambitious goal, net zero emissions by 2045,
Hmm.
which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the question becomes, how do they actually get there?
It's definitely a compelling challenge,
Yeah.
all that natural potential, but still relying on costly imports.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what brings us to our deep dive today. We're going to explore the potential of ocean energy.
Okay.
We're looking closely at this study titled Ocean Energy Enabling a Sustainable Energy Industry Transition for Hawaii,
Right.
and how it suggests the power of the ocean could, well, really revolutionize the state's energy future.
Okay. Ocean energy enabling a sustainable energy industry transition for Hawaii.
Yeah.
Quite a title. So when we talk about ocean energy in this study, what specific technologies are we focusing on?
Well, this study zeroes in on three key areas: offshore floating photovoltaics, think vast solar arrays on the water,
Okay, floating solar. Got it.
then offshore wind power, and also the technology to capture the immense energy of ocean waves.
Offshore solar and wind, we know the land-based versions, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Taking them out to sea adds a fascinating layer. And wave power. That sounds like harnessing a really fundamental force.
It really is.
Why is this study so particularly relevant for a place like Hawaii?
That's a critical question. Hawaii, like a lot of islands and regions where land is just tight, faces inherent limitations with, traditional onshore renewables.
Like, space is limited.
Exactly. Space is limited, and putting up huge solar or wind farms can sometimes lead to conflicts over land use.
Sure.
The ocean, on the other hand, it presents this vast, largely untapped resource. It could potentially bypass those land constraints.
So it's about powering paradise without sacrificing the paradise itself, at least in terms of land use.
Precisely. And what makes this study, Ocean Energy Enabling a Sustainable Energy Industry Transition for Hawaii, so insightful is that it doesn't just look at these ocean energy techs in isolation.
Okay.
It delves into the potentially surprising ways they could actually work together, creating a more robust, more efficient overall energy system for the state.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, there are some real aha moments that kind of emerge as we dig into this research.
I'm definitely intrigued. So Hawaii's commitment, net zero by 2045, as highlighted in this study, tell me more about that ambition and how ocean energy, according to this research, fits into their current thinking.
Yeah, Hawaii's 2022 pledge really does position them as a frontrunner, setting aggressive renewable targets. What's interesting, as this study points out, is that the idea of ocean energy isn't entirely new there.
Oh, really?
No, the study reminds us of early exploration, even some initial deployment of ocean thermal energy conversion, OTEC. That dates back to like 1979.
Wow, OTEC. That's using the temperature difference in the ocean depths, right?
Yeah.
Another fascinating area.
Exactly. And more recently, permits have been granted for wave energy projects, so it shows a continued interest.
So it sounds like Hawaii has been considering the ocean's potential for quite some time. How does this specific study see these ocean sources fitting into their more immediate energy plans?
Well, even in their existing energy projections, before this particular study's analysis, there was already a growing recognition of the role offshore wind could play.
Okay.
So the idea of looking towards the ocean for cleaner energy solutions is definitely gaining traction in their state planning, which aligns perfectly with what this study explores.
That makes sense. I mean, you can't rely just on sunshine,
Not in
right?
2047, no.
Which brings up the importance of having a diverse mix of renewables. Why is this so crucial, especially for an island state like Hawaii, according to this study?
You've hit on a vital point that this study really emphasizes. Globally, yeah, we're seeing a big trend towards variable renewables like solar and onshore wind. But for Hawaii, this study underscores the critical need for supply diversity. I mean, imagine relying only on solar. What happens when the sun sets or you get those really heavy overcast days?
Yeah, or only on wind, and the winds are calm, you'd have some serious reliability issues.
Exactly. So having a mix, as investigated here, is fundamentally about ensuring a stable power supply.
Right.
And for Hawaii, this study also highlights avoiding those land use conflicts we talked about. Plus, they point out that electricity demand there is actually projected to increase.
Ah, okay. So more demand, limited land, diversity becomes key.
Precisely. And to figure out the best pathways, this research used a sophisticated tool called the LUT Energy System Transition Model.
A model, okay.
Yeah, it allowed them to simulate various energy scenarios for the state, see what might happen under different
Okay,
conditions.
so they used simulations in this study. What was the central question they were trying to answer with this model?
The core question was basically, under what specific conditions could offshore wind and wave power become the most cost-effective solutions for Hawaii's energy needs?
Okay.
So they compared different possibilities. They looked at a scenario where the model could just freely choose the absolute cheapest options.
The sort of ideal cost scenario.
Kind of, yeah, versus scenarios where they intentionally limited the contribution from solar power specifically,
Hmm.
capping it at 60% or 80% of the total electricity supply.
Interesting. So by putting those limits on solar, as described in the study, they were essentially forcing the system to explore alternatives.
Exactly. They were pushing it to see what else becomes viable. They also looked at two main strategies for the whole system. Hawaii generating all its own sustainable fuels, they call that self-supply,
Right.
versus importing electricity-based fuels like green hydrogen or e-fuels from other regions.
Got it. Self-sufficient versus importing clean fuels. And what were the key findings when they started limiting solar in those models?
Well, the study revealed that, yeah, capping solar does create opportunities for ocean energy tech.
Okay.
They found that by 2050, limiting solar could lead to integrating somewhere between 0 and 2.3 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity
Significant.
and potentially a really substantial 0 to 4.1 gigawatts of wave power.
Wow, wave power really comes into play then.
It certainly can in these scenarios. But this increased diversity did come with a projected increase in overall system costs.
Ah, there's the trade-off. How much?
Well, the range was pretty wide, actually, anywhere from maybe 3.5% up to 28%.
28%. That's a huge range. Why such a variation?
It really depended on the specific scenario how much solar was limited, whether it was self-supply or import, and crucially, the assumed future costs of these technologies, especially wave power.
Right, the cost projections for tech that's still developing can vary a lot.
Exactly. But here's where a particularly interesting finding comes out, that aha moment we mentioned. Under the self-supply scenario, with that 80% solar limit, the research identified this novel interaction between all three key offshore technologies.
All three, so wind, wave,
And offshore floating PV. They found that zero point 0.6 to 1.1 gigawatts of floating solar could actually contribute a significant chunk, like 12.3% of total electricity generation by 2050.
Wow. So it wasn't just wind and waves filling the gap from limited land-based solar. Floating solar itself became a major player under those specific conditions.
That's what the modeling suggested, yeah. It challenges the simple assumption that land-based solar is always the dominant renewable for islands, especially when you factor in constraints.
That really is an aha moment. Okay, let's delve deeper into these individual ocean technologies the study looked at. What did it specifically find regarding the potential of wave power in Hawaii?
Well, this study indicates Hawaii has truly substantial wave energy resources. The estimate is around 380 terawatt hours per year.
380 TY. That's a massive amount of potential power.
It really is. And the researchers noted that peak wave power tends to happen in January, which is interesting regarding seasonal complementarity.
So when other renewables might be dipping, the waves could be surging. That sounds like a really valuable balance, as noted in the study.
Exactly, that complementarity is key. And the study found that maybe 50 terawatt hours of this could potentially be harnessed at competitive costs. They projected below 70 euros per megawatt hour by 2050.
Below 70 euro, Nicolas, that sounds pretty good for 2050.
It does. However, the authors do acknowledge that the technological maturity of wave energy converters is, well, cretinely lower compared to solar or wind.
Lower tech maturity. Does that just mean it's still in earlier stages of development, less proven at scale?
Pretty much, yeah. And the study hints this might be partly due to maybe lower levels of dedicated funding compared to other renewable sectors.
That makes sense. Development needs investment. What about OTEC, the ocean thermal energy conversion we mentioned earlier? Did this study explore its potential much?
This particular paper touches on OTEC mainly by referencing the ongoing research and those historical projects in Hawaii.
Okay.
The authors note that investigations into the techno-economic feasibility are continuing, but it wasn't a primary focus of their specific modeling and analysis here.
Understood. So OTEC is still out there as a possibility, but not central to this analysis. Let's turn to offshore wind then, as discussed in the study. Given Hawaii's ocean surroundings, it must have huge offshore wind potential.
Absolutely huge. The study highlights a vast available area over 700,000 square kilometers,
Wow.
with a potential capacity estimated at 5.4 terawatts.
5.4 terawatts. That's enormous.
It's a staggering resource. However, the research also points out that the expected costs are higher compared to some other
I
places,
asked that.
primarily because of the need for more expensive floating wind turbine structures in Hawaii's deep waters.
Ah, right. Unlike the fixed foundations you see in shallower waters elsewhere, Hawaii would likely need these floating platforms.
Correct. The study mentions anchoring limitations generally restrict floating turbines to depths between, say, 700 and 1,300 meters.
Okay.
But the good news is, with offshore wind really picking up globally, we could expect substantial cost reductions for floating tech in the future.
Let's hope so. Now, back to that surprising finding about offshore floating solar. Could you elaborate on why this tech is gaining importance, especially for islands, according to this study?
Yeah, offshore floating PV is becoming increasingly relevant, particularly for land-constrained places like Hawaii, as this study really underscores.
Right.
It just offers a way to harness solar energy on a significant scale without using up valuable land.
That makes perfect sense.
And the researchers here assume that the installation density, basically how much power you can pack onto a floating platform, will keep improving as the tech advances.
Okay.
They even referred to a specific figure in their paper showing the annual full load hours for floating PV within Hawaii's exclusive economic zone. It gives an idea of the consistent sunlight available offshore.
Full load hours that basically tells us how often the panels are running near their peak output.
Right. Exactly. It's a measure of how good and consistent that solar resource is out on the water.
Okay, so we've looked at the individual texts through the lens of this study. Now, how does limiting land-based solar PV actually create these opportunities for wind, wave, and especially that floating solar surprise?
Well, when you put a hard cap on how much electricity can come from onshore solar, the energy system model basically has to find other ways to meet the total demand cost effectively.
It's forced to look around.
Exactly. Initially, as this study demonstrates, onshore wind tends to increase its share. Makes sense, it's often the next cheapest option.
Yeah.
But as the potential for onshore wind gets more fully utilized or hits its own limits, then offshore options become relatively more attractive.
It's like a cascade. Once you max out one resource, you naturally turn to the next best available ones.
That's a good way to think about it. The study details how the generation shares shift in those 60% and 80% solar limit scenarios.
Right.
You see onshore wind pick up, then offshore wind takes on a bigger role, and eventually wave power starts entering the mix.
Okay.
And interestingly, the study found that if the cost of wave power technology drops significantly by 2050,
Which is a big if, but possible.
right, a key assumption. But if that happens, it could actually become preferable to adding even more offshore wind capacity in certain scenarios.
So cost is still king, even when you're trying to diversify.
Absolutely. Cost projections drive these model outcomes significantly, and that novel interaction we saw offshore wind, wave, and floating PV all playing major roles in that 80% solar limit self-supply case.
Yeah.
That's a key insight. It suggests a future where these aren't just backups, but maybe integrated components of a really optimized system.
It sounds like a complex but potentially very rewarding balancing act, according to this study. What are some of the broader impacts on the whole energy system when you integrate more of these diverse ocean renewables?
Well, one significant impact the study points out is that more diversity can actually lead to a reduction in the total electricity generation capacity you need to build.
Less capacity needed overall. How does that work?
Because wind and wave power tend to have higher full load hours compared to solar in many places, they generate power closer to their maximum potential for more hours of the year.
Ah, I see.
So think of it like this. A power plant that runs more consistently is more efficient in a systems sense. You don't need to build as much extra peaker capacity that only runs occasionally.
Right. You don't need as many total power plants if the ones you have are working harder more often. Makes sense.
Exactly. The research also looked at energy storage needs batteries for electricity and also heat storage.
Okay.
They found that when you have more complementary sources, like solar peaking during the day and maybe wave power being stronger at other times,
You might need less storage to smooth things out.
potentially, yeah, less need to store massive amounts of solar energy for nighttime use if wave or wind are contributing then.
Interesting. That could save a lot on battery costs.
It could. The study also considered the implications for power-to-X technologies.
Power to X. Like making hydrogen.
Exactly. Converting electricity into other energy carriers like hydrogen or synthetic fuels, which are crucial for decarbonizing sectors like shipping or aviation.
Right.
In those self-supply scenarios where Hawaii makes its own e-fuels, having that diverse electricity supply affects how much hydrogen gets made via electrolysis and maybe even the role of things like steam methane reforming early in the transition.
Okay, so it really cascades through the entire energy infrastructure. Now let's talk dollars and cents, or euros in this case. Cost.
Yeah.
How do these different scenarios affect the price of electricity?
Well, the study projects increases in the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE.
Right, the average cost per unit generated.
Yeah, that tends to go up in scenarios with limited solar and more reliance on offshore tech, which generally has higher upfront investment costs right now.
Okay, so generating the electricity itself might get a bit pricier.
It might. But when the researchers looked at the levelized cost of final energy, the LCOAE, which includes fuels and heat too.
The whole energy picture for the end user.
Sort of, yeah. That increase was less pronounced, especially when they factored in the option of importing e-fuels instead of making everything locally.
So while electricity generation costs might rise slightly with more offshore, the total energy bill impact might not be as sharp, especially if importing some fuels is cheaper. That's a nuanced finding.
It is. And encouragingly, the study found that most of the scenarios still lead to lower total annualized energy system costs by 2050 compared to 2020.
That's the key takeaway, really. Overall system costs are still projected to go down long-term in most renewable futures.
Exactly. It underscores the long-term economic viability of making this transition. The research also highlighted, cost differences between self-supply and e-fuel import strategies when you have that more diverse renewable mix.
That's reassuring. Now, Hawaii is unique, but are these findings relevant elsewhere for other islands facing similar challenges?
Absolutely. The study specifically makes that point, broadening the scope to consider other land-constrained island regions grappling with similar energy transition issues.
Okay.
And the authors point to other research that has also found potential roles for offshore energy in various island contexts.
So Hawaii's experience, as analyzed here, could kind of serve as a case study? Maybe even a partial blueprint for other islands?
I think that's fair to say. While the study reinforces that solar will likely remain crucial, they even use the term solar to X economy.
Right.
It emphasizes that the complementary role of ocean energy sources like wind and wave is vital for successful island energy transitions.
But it's not without challenges, I assume.
Definitely not. They do caution that careful planning is essential. You have to consider impacts on shipping routes, tourism, marine ecosystems, all those environmental concerns associated with building large structures offshore.
Important considerations, absolutely. Needs careful balancing. So, to wrap up our deep dive, what's the main message from ocean energy enabling a sustainable energy industry transition for Hawaii?
I think the core message is that ocean energy tech, especially wave power and offshore floating PV, holds really significant potential. It can play a cost-effective and crucial supporting role alongside solar in Hawaii's path to 100% renewables.
Especially when land is tight and you value that system diversity and resilience.
Exactly. It's
Right.
about building a more robust overall system.
And that novel interaction, floating solar, offshore wind, and wave power, all working together under certain conditions. That provides a fascinating glimpse into a potentially highly optimized energy future, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows the potential for synergy. Now, the authors are clear uncertainties remain, particularly around the future cost of wave power. That's a big one.
Sure.
And they suggest more research is needed on things like grid integration on specific islands and maybe exploring other ocean sources like OTEC or tidal power more deeply.
Clearly, the ocean still holds a lot more possibilities for future exploration. So, for you, the listener, thinking about Hawaii's experience from this study, ocean energy enabling a sustainable energy industry transition for Hawaii. What innovative ocean energy solutions might be relevant for your specific region or context?
Yeah, as the world transitions to sustainable energy.
It really prompts you to think beyond just the usual suspects, beyond conventional solar and onshore wind, and consider that huge untapped potential in our oceans. This has been a really insightful deep dive into ocean energy enabling a sustainable energy industry transition for Hawaii.
Definitely offers valuable perspectives on building that cleaner energy future.